Well, now, the story about Spotify, you might have been following over the course of the weekend. It started off with Neil Young, a man who's so old now that when you ask anyone under the age of about 45 if they've ever heard of him, they go, not really. But Neil Young is certainly part of my youth, certainly part of my heritage, growing up listening to Neil Young. He was somebody that I thought was a brilliant musician. He's had a big row with Spotify. He doesn't like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is someone, if you're over the age of 45, you've probably never heard of either. It's a sort of age versus youth argument, this. Joe Rogan is a podcaster who is generally thought to be, I would suppose you might say, in favour with many people who would consider themselves to be on the right of politics, people who would consider themselves to be libertarians, freedom fighters. He's been accused by Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, who's another sort of ex-hippie who used to be a fantastic performer but now suffers from ill health. He's basically been accused of making misstatements about COVID, and they are considered to be older people who are concerned about the danger of giving out misinformation, as they call it. He basically said, Neil Young, to Spotify, it's either him or it's me. You either carry my music on your platform or you carry his podcast. You can't have both. In the end, Spotify decided, well, we won't bother with you, Neil, thanks very much indeed. We'll stick with Joe Rogan. Now, he's kept quiet until relatively recently. Just a few hours ago, he sent out a statement on video. Here's what he had to say.
I'm not mad at Neil Young. I'm a huge Neil Young fan. I've always been a Neil Young fan. When I was 19, I was a security guard at a place called Great Woods in Mansfield, Massachusetts. It's an outdoor concert amphitheater, and Neil Young was playing there, and that was the last day I worked there. I quit during the Neil Young concert. The job was kind of crazy because there was a lot of times it was fights broke out and stuff, and I think I probably got like $15 an hour, and I was not about to get beat up for $15 an hour. So I would bring a hoodie with me whenever I worked. So in case it hit the fan and it got too crazy, I would just put my hoodie on and leave and cover my security outfit, my security shirt. So one day during a Neil Young concert, there's the amphitheater, the way it's set up is there's a covered area outside that has seats, and then there's a lawn area behind it. And the lawn area, during the Neil Young concert, they got a little rowdy. It was cold out, and they started bonfires. So they had these raging fires on the lawn, and we were supposed to go and put these fires out and stop them. So we tried for a little while, but then brawls started breaking out, and it started getting crazy. And I was like, this. So I put my hoodie on, I zipped it up, and I left. And I drove home, and as I was driving home, I was singing, "Keep on rocking in a free world." That was my last day on the job. I don't even think I collected my last check. So no hard feelings towards Neil Young, and definitely no hard feelings towards Joni Mitchell. I love her too. I love her music. Chucky's in Love is a great song.
See, it's easy to be magnanimous when you've won hands down, isn't it? Joe Rogan there, pretty much sticking it to Neil Young and to Joni Mitchell. By the way, saying and admitting, listen, I've got no hard feelings. Well, he doesn't need any hard feelings. He's got 100 million listens on his podcast. He's got millions of people listening to him. Neil Young, as Rod Little pointed out, if you are listening to him, you're probably not listening to him on Spotify, to be fair. But, of course, no big new media row could be complete without the involvement of Harry and Meghan, because they got involved as well and decided, because, of course, they've got an £18 million deal with Spotify, they said that they would like to see Spotify take a little more care about what they put out on their platform. Not offering to give back the 18 million quid, however, that they've only made one podcast for. Let us talk instead now to Jason Reed, UK lead at Young Voices, political commentator. Jason, a very good morning to you, I should say.
Good morning, Mike.
I mean, this could only be a sort of storm at this particular time, 2022, 11:40 in the morning. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Isn't it ridiculous?
It's absolutely ridiculous. It's very strange. I'm triple vaccinated myself, but I just don't understand this disdain and this terror that people seem to have between ahead of people talking openly about COVID and about restrictions and about vaccines. The people who Joe Rogan had on his podcast weren't even very controversial. The standard that seems to be being used is that they expressed views that were contrary to the advice of the Centre for Disease Protection, Prevention and Control, which is like the American version of what we used to call Public Health England. But if that's the standard for what's allowed in public debate, then I mean, this show is gone for a start, isn't it?
Well,
Are we
I mean,
not
the
allowed
thing
to
is,
criticise Chris Whitty now?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, there was a time when there was a politician who was put up, was he not, Was it Neil O'Brien? Can't remember his name. Neil O'Brien, who was put up as a kind of witchfinder general, who was apparently collecting a list of people that he thought were COVID deniers in the media. And I don't know what he's planning to do with that list, but I can tell you where he can shove it. And as a result, he got a place in the cabinet, and he was generally thought to be Matt Hancock's. What was it they called him? He was the sort of the house pet of Matt Hancock's, because he was doing anything that Matt Hancock told him to do. And there was a time when you were kind of breaching all sorts of rules if you started talking about things which we now talk about perfectly openly.
I don't think being Matt Hancock's house pet is a good idea for a number of reasons. Goodness knows what you might see or stumble onto.
Indeed.
But this is just the textbook Barbara Streisand effect, isn't it? If you're trying to draw attention to Joe Rogan's views or these kinds of conversations, this is the perfect way to do it. That's exactly what Neil Young and Joni Mitchell have done. They've shown a complete misunderstanding of the way media consumption works. I'm 21 years old. I'd be hard-pressed to name a Neil Young song or to miss Joni Mitchell from Spotify if she goes off there as well. They've made themselves very irrelevant. And Joe Rogan, in that clip you just played, it seemed positively statesmanlike in comparison to their screeching and throwing their toys out the pram. A very, very dignified response. He's got Spotify on his side because he's hugely valuable. Reportedly, they paid over $100 million just for the privilege of having his podcast on their platform because so many people listen to it.
Yes, but isn't it interesting that you do have some protection? You know, J.K. Rowling, I'm sure, would not be still being published by her publishers if, in fact, she was not quite so successful, in the same way that Ricky Gervais can't be cancelled because he's so successful. Joe Rogan now, I think, is in that category, because if he wasn't Joe Rogan and if he wasn't making them hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm sure they might bend to the will, not least of the Duke and Duchess of Netflix.
I'm sure they would. The Duke and Duchess of Netflix, as you say, exactly, Harry and Meghan, would love to be able to exert this kind of control, and they are acting as if they do have this control over Spotify anyway, despite, as you were talking about in your intro, having to have that embarrassing climb back where Spotify have taken over podcast production from their own production company because they only managed to produce one episode in a year, despite a budget of $30 million thereabouts. I think it's more than anything, it's patronizing and it's delusional from the likes of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell that they're so terrified that people like you and me might be exposed to a variety of views and that we might make up our own minds rather than just accepting the received wisdom. And Joe Rogan's solution, as he said in his statement, is that he's very happy to host a range of voices and host people who disagree with those controversial guests, which is something that's not a surprise because he's a big believer in free speech. But that won't solve the issue. If you're Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, you object to the wrong views being aired at any time, even if they're then followed by ones that disagree. So they're still not going to be happy, are they?
And of course, you'll be too young to remember this, but Neil Young is no snowflake. I mean, this is a guy who once recommended people vote for Ronald Reagan as a Republican. He was a guy that took part in something called Farm Aid, which was generally regarded as a Republican sort of fundraising event for farmers in the Midwest who were getting done over by a Democrat government. He also, at one point, was pretty disrespectful to AIDS victims and talked about AIDS in a way which, if he did it today, he would be cancelled. So, you know, what goes around comes around for Neil Young, but it's all fascinating stuff. And, of course, Spotify, I think, have now come out and said that they're going to put some kind of warning on podcasts which may contain controversial misinformation.
It's very strange, this censorious mindset, isn't it? And I can assure you that if you're one of Joe Rogan's regular listeners, you're not going to be put off by one of those health warnings like they have on Twitter now and like they might have on Spotify saying you might be exposed to new information or to some views you disagree with, because that's exactly the reason people listen to Joe Rogan's podcast. This instinct to censor, this very strange desire to put people in little boxes and say that person's an anti-vaxxer, that person's good, that person's bad. Joe Rogan himself is in many senses very left-wing. For a time, he supported Bernie Sanders in the presidential election. He's basically the American Jeremy Corbyn before he switched to Trump. There's a lot more complexity, a lot more depth to these things. You can't just put people in boxes and put them over there when they say things you don't like. Well, exactly, that's not the way the world works.
It sounds far too sensible for this lot, Jason. Thank you very much indeed. Jason Reed, UK lead at Younger Voices, making an awful lot of sense about the Spotify scenario. Let's hope they don't try and censor the thought police, because that would be horrendous. There may be some warnings on that particular podcast with me and Kevin O'Sullivan, but it won't be about COVID misinformation, I have to say.